Okay. Okay. So like I said, my name is Kathy Sacco, and background about myself, I was adopted at the age of 5.5 from Korea, and I was adopted with my biological sister, and she was 9 months old. So we were adopted together into the same home. And during the adoption process, so my parents are were Caucasian. They have both passed away. But they're Caucasian, and they decided that they had been trying for about 5 years to have kids. They were considered actually too old to be adopting domestically at the time. So then they had looked at like foster care adoption, and then they had heard about Korean adoptions. So they ended up going to Korean adoptions. And during the adoption process, my mom ended up getting pregnant. And so we came home, and actually on Christmas Eve, and then 5 months later, my mom had my brother. So I'm also part of what's called a blended family, where there are both adopted and biological children in the same family. And then with my dad's job, we moved around all over the US. And so I consider myself more of a Westerner because I did most of my growing up kind of in the West in Montana, California, and Arizona and things. And just with my experience, I think I just always liked children and wanted to do something to help kids, and essentially felt like giving children the chance, at what I thought I had like a really great family. And so I thought that that was important. And so then that led to my interest in going into social work. I just knew I wanted to do something with child welfare. And so then, when I first got out with my MSW, I worked in a prevention program in the middle schools, and then that funding actually got cut by the federal government. And so then I ended up at a contract agency, St. Nicholas Adoptions I was in Tucson, Arizona at the time, and they were a contract agency to Child Protective Services. And so then I did foster care adoptions, with them. And so, yeah, when I first started with social work, wasn't planning on doing adoptions, but fell into it. I really liked it. And then I met my husband in grad school. We moved to Connecticut, and then I got into another adoption agency, did infant adoptions, and then ended up, they did international adoptions. So then I did international adoptions. And it happened, the agency that I was working with worked with the same Korean agency that my sister and I were adopted through. And so then I got to travel to Korea. And through that whole process, the internet at the time was blowing up. And so all sorts of Korean adoptees were connecting. And where I thought I would never be able to find my birth family, I ended up being able to search for them and got reconnected with my birth family. So I can talk about that. And then as I was doing kind of that first, frontline direct practice, I felt like I was seeing where there was weaknesses, where processes and laws and regulations and needed to be changed. So I was advocating for that. And at the same time, the United States was looking at joining the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoptions. And so I had the opportunity to testify before Congress. So that kind of piqued my interest in developing policy and being part of the policy mechanism. And and then I had the opportunity to work at the State Department, the U.S. Department of State, in the Office of Children's Issues, which serves as the central authority, the U.S. central authority on the Hague Convention that governs intercountry adoptions. And then after that, I now currently work at First Focus on Children. That is a bipartisan advocacy organization for children. So I can kind of talk about that a little bit. So that's my development as a social worker, kind of going from direct practice into policy. So and would be happy to talk about whatever questions that you might have, um, and things, and to go through it. So I don't know, Dr. Boone, is there something more specific that you'd like to talk or, ask about? I'm happy to answer.
I think that was great. I think that the class is very insightful. So I'm sure they have all the questions.
Sure.
I think all the things that you said that you could elaborate on, I would like to hear all of that. I'd love to hear
Okay.
more, yeah, about your, personal experience and all of that. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Well, let me okay, so we can start like at the time, I think I had mentioned at the time that my parents adopted, they were considered, they were like, I got to think, they were about 30 years old and 34. So at the time, that was considered like they were really old. And like I said, they were considered too old to really adopt domestically. So they were discouraged from that. My dad worked in Vietnam, had a stint when he was working in Vietnam. So that was why he was sort of interested, I guess, in Asian adoptions when they were given the option of, there's adoptions from Korea. So just to give you a little background on Korean adoptions, Korea was like the first, what do I say, first mass kind of Korean intercountry transnational adoptions to start. There had been some adoptions like post World War II or during World War II with like you know s- German children and things like that. But as far as mass numbers, it started with Korean adoptions, and that was post Korea, the Korean War. And it originally started, there was Korea, of course, there's you know, extreme poverty, economically, they were not that strong, and a very poor country. So post-Korean War, um, there was a lot of children because of the UN soldiers, US soldiers being there. There was a lot of children that were of mixed race. And so due to the economic conditions, and then also because children who were mixed were not accepted into society, um, that that they were rejected. And so then that's kind of what started. It was the Holt family, Harry Holt. So you might have heard about them. There's one of the largest adoption agencies based out of Oregon. They kind of started this. He was over there in Korea. He brought like 8 children of mixed race back from Korea into Oregon. It caused a big media storm. There literally had to be changes in immigration law and things to allow these children to be brought into the US and for adoption. And so that media storm then caused other people to want to come forward to adopt and things. That also kind of tied in with the number of infant adoptions. Infants available for adoption in the United States was also going down. So this was kind of like another avenue for people to be able to build their families was through Korean adoption. So I'm gonna put this link here. This has this site kind of has some good like history about adoption, not only Korean adoptions, but just kind of adoption in general. So that might be something that you can look at that has some of the history. So, like I said, there's a large scale adoption. Some people called it a social experiment because this was a large number of placements of children who are obviously of Asian descent, Korean descent being placed, and usually predominantly Caucasian homes. So it was going to be, what's going to happen to these children. Um, and so that the number of Korean adoptions continue to grow. There was a little blip in 1988 you might have heard about where what was it, Bryant Gumbel, I think it was the 88 Olympics that were taking place in Seoul, and he made some kind of comment about how children were Korea's largest export. And so then adoptions got shut down, but then they promptly, they opened back up. So, and then other intercountry adoptions grew where China, Russia, Romania, Guatemala, Vietnam, all these adoptions. So the number of intercountry adoptions really peaked probably in, I would say, uh, like in the early 2000s, it really peaked. So there was about roughly about 20,000 intercountry adoptions of children, who are adopted from other countries into the United States. Um, and now it has since dropped, down, what is it? I forget what the, like, is it down to, I think about in the hundreds now? So, um, yeah, I think it's like down to the hundreds now. So, So that's like a little bit of history. And so what happened was this tremendous growth um, in intercountry adoptions brought out like what do I want to say, weaknesses in the process. Um, and at the same time, as this growth was happening, then kind of that first generation of Korean adoptees were also growing up. And so they were giving voice to their experience of what it was like to grow up in oftentimes in communities where they were the only Asian person in the community. They didn't have access, or they were so assimilated that they didn't have any access or knowledge of their birth culture and things. And so adult adoptees were talking about that. And so then that also led to the growth of things like homeland tours, where Korean adoptees would go back and visit Korea so that they would have a sense of, what their birth country was like. There was culture camps. There was a growth of support groups. And then also, I would say that there was a professionalization that was happening even within adoption agencies. So many of the early intercountry adoption agencies, or adoption agencies that did practice with other countries, were oftentimes maybe adoptive parents. They started the adoption agencies and they adopted a child from Romania, had a good experience. Other people were wanting to know, oh, well, we want to adopt from Romania. How do we do that? So then these parents would start the adoption agency. So like at the time that I got into the field, I had my MSW. There's actually a number of us then had also gotten our MSW, was interested in going into the field and into the practice. So like I said, it was kind of more of a professionalization. We had our master's, social work degrees, and then we were oftentimes in the agency, the only adoptee in the agency, or sometimes we felt like we we're the token adoptee. But a lot of times, like my motivation to go into the adoption agency was that I really wanted to help educate and make the adoption process better for kids. And I thought that I could do that. And also at that time, that if you go, and even still, I think now, state to state, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, there was no overarching requirements for the way a home study was conducted, post-placement services. None of that was happening or available. And so some of that was the things that I was pushing. I designed education courses because there wasn't anything like that in the agencies that I was working at. Some agencies would maybe do a 2 hour education course on how, issues that you would think about adopting, from if you're adopting from China, and then you got a 2 hour education course, that was it. So I had designed like a 20 hour, broken out education course. I will tell you, there are some families who didn't come to our agency because they didn't want to have to do that. They wanted it quick and fast, and they didn't want to have to go through those efforts. And there were agencies who didn't have it. So anyway, just to kind of give you a sense of just the disparate, the way adoption was practiced, the way it was delivered, or, once the child got home, there was no post-adoption services. Now, I would also say there's two different systems. So foster care adoption was very different than the private. So intercountry adoption, or like even infant adoptions, are considered private adoptions. So it's a completely different system. And things that also kind of changed how adoptive parents, maybe our prospective adoptive parents, looked at it. And I particularly saw that, having done foster care adoptions in Arizona and then going into the private adoptions. So, for foster care adoptions, right, oftentimes potential foster parents or prospective adoptive parents out of the foster care system, they don't have to pay for the home study, like everything is paid for. But on the private adoptions, it is the adoptive parents who are paying for the home study. So you can see what the tension is that they are paying for this product. So if you're trying to evaluate them and they're saying, why are you saying that I can't be a parent when I paid you all this money? And then it was also kind of the idea of they were ordering a child. So it's like, we're paying all this money, so we demand like a healthy baby. Or I had a horrible situation where it was like the family was saying, they wanted to request a girl to adopt from Korea, and they said, we don't want one of those girls that like kind of have the chinky eyes, the really slanty eyes. We've noticed that girls like from Korea have like the really kind of slitty eyes. And so then we were like, I was staffing that and going, this is not appropriate, this is like not a good fit. And they were then angry because they're going, we're paying for this, so we can tell you what we want. So just I kind of share that to show you kind of the differences that can happen with like foster care adoption, and also, intercountry adoption and things. So under that is then there was the Hague Adoption Convention. Um, and there's something called the Hague Convention on civil law. I apologize that I'm slaughtering that. But what happens is it's not like you might have heard about the Hague and things. This is not the Hague that, you might think about war crimes. This is a different Hague. It's a Hague private conference on international law. And what happens is that this Hague Conference is trying to give civil remedies or things for countries to work on and sign treaties to work cooperatively together on different issues and things. So one of those issues was intercountry adoption. And so there's this Hague Convention that, they hammered out agreements about how intercountry adoption should work between countries and when countries signed on to the convention, et cetera. So we signed on, and then we had to ratify it. And so the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption was in 1993, and then we finally ratified it because it has to go through Congress. Like Congress ratifies any treaties and things. So it went through Congress, and that's where I testified in support of us joining that convention. And so we signed on in what was it? Like 2004, I think that we signed on. And then it went into effect. So let me uh I will so this is the Hague Convention. And please, anyone stop me if you have questions, because I'm just like feel like I'm rambling here. Okay, and then this is actually the office. So the first thing I was talking about was the Hague Convention, and then this is the office in the State Department. And so the office in the State Department is called Office of Children's Issues, which is pretty much of a misnomer because there's only two children's issues. They do one on international parental child abduction and then on intercountry adoption. And like I said, those are both Hague Conventions. And then that office in the State Department serves as the central authority. So that office like does the day-to-day kind of management of those conventions and working with other countries and working with families, etc. So, Melissa, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you kind of shared this information at the beginning because I joined a little bit late, but
No problem.
I wonder because I just don't know. So my daughter is deaf and she goes to a school for the deaf, and I noticed like the Asian population there is pretty big, and I know that there's families who go and adopt a deaf child from places from different countries in Asia because they're deaf, so they want to give that access. So like to me, um, and I don't want to offend anyone, but to me, like that makes sense. Like you're deaf, you have a skill, like a culture to share. Um, but sometimes there's a lot of kids here. What is
Mhm.
usually what drives families to go and adopt abroad versus adopt in their country? Like, do you ever get that information or sort of like what's the push?
Sure. Yeah, a lot of times, families, when they would come to adopt or to choose adoption, internationally, was some of it was about speed and how quickly they could get the adoption. So at its peak, like sometimes you could from start to finish get a child from intercountry adoption like within 6 months. So sometimes like foster care adoptions, or if you're doing an infant adoption, could take, you don't know, infant adoption could take a long time. I think there was also some sense sometimes like adopting children out of foster care system that they were maybe like more damaged or that they had a lot more abuse and things that families didn't want to have to deal with. Um, yeah, I would say those are like the big, were the big drivers. So, did they answer your question, Melissa?
It did. Thank you. So the kids abroad, they're not in foster care. They've already.
They are now. Some places they didn't have foster care systems, so that they're in orphanages. So depending on which country, depending on which agency, what service, like even in the case for my sister and me, we for some reason were in a foster home. So we were in an orphanage for a little bit, and then we were in a foster home, which actually at that time was unusual. I still don't know why we were in a foster home because most of the people that I know that were adopted at the time at the same time as my sister and me were not in foster homes. They came directly from orphanages. And so a lot of times they were from, orphanages and things. I think the process started changing like when I was doing adoptions from Korea, back in the early 2000s and things, all the babies, like all the children were in foster homes. So, and then even China was like moving towards foster care versus being in the orphanages.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm. Okay. So with the institution of the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption, I think that people felt like when that went into effect, that the number of adoptions started going down. And so a lot of people blamed it on the Hague Convention. And then there was also a lot of heat that that was slowing down adoptions and, like I said, reducing the numbers. I would argue that the reason, the intercountry or the Hague Convention went into effect to try to protect all the parties involved and trying to make the adoption process better and more transparent and take out the fraud and corruption that could potentially happen. So, and particularly because we are hearing stories when there's money that changes hands, when there's the situation of like rich countries, the rich country of the United States going into a poor country, like or a poorer country than the United States. So going into Guatemala, going into Ethiopia, into Russia, there was just the process was rife for potential corruption and fraud. And as adult adoptees got older and returned to their birth country, then more stories were coming out about as they were finding birth families and finding out that there was fraud and corruption in the adoption process and things. So that came out. And so what the or the Hague Adoption Convention was trying to do was based on the principle of subsidiarity. And so for those, if you know what subsidiarity means, it's essentially looking at the easiest or most local solution. And so subsidiarity was saying you need to look at family preservation or keeping the child within their family or community first before looking at intercountry adoption. So you could say that, that intercountry adoption should technically be the last resort, that you're looking at options within the country, well, within, trying to keep, for instance, the child with their parents within the family, within the community, within the country, and then looking at intercountry adoption. And then it was also looking at safeguards against trafficking, that each country that signed on to the Hague Convention, they needed to have a central authority that, the process and documents will go through. And then it also gave like for instance, with the United States being central authority, then you would communicate with the central authority in China and things, if there's any problems or things that would come up. Now, the interesting thing that the United States did that other countries wouldn't. So other countries, for instance, if they signed on to the Hague Adoption Convention, they would say they would only work with other convention countries. So they would not work with countries who hadn't signed on to the Adoption Convention. The United States did not. So we would still continue to work with convention or non-convention countries and things. What else can I tell you? So, like I said, in the Office of Children's Issues, we tried to do intercountry adoption policy oversight. We also looked at accreditation of adoption service providers or the adoption agencies. And as I stated earlier, there was no kind of one standard across the United States. So the nice thing about the adoption, about us signing on to the Adoption Convention, we finally got universal standards across the US, so that there was a minimum standard of 8 hours of education, that there was, some standard on the home study process and what was expected post-adoption, those kinds of things. So at least there was a minimum standard across the board, and that if you were an adoption agency who was trying to work in intercountry adoptions, that you had to be accredited and you had to go through an accreditation process. So that was also protection for prospective adoptive parents, for instance, because there was situations where they got scammed by, not reputable brokers or people who worked in it. And then that also gave diplomacy between sending countries or receiving countries. So the interesting thing is when I worked there, because intercountry adoption and then the other issue, the international parental child abduction that our office worked in, it was a big constituent issue. So we got a lot of calls and inquiries from members of Congress, because if you were someone who was having problems with their adoption, you might call your senator. Or, if you're having problems with your case or whatever. So then the senators or representatives will call our office and say what's going on. So there was a lot of stuff going on. So they actually appointed an ambassador to our office to work on all these kind of diplomacy issues, and then also work, diplomacy with countries and things like that. And so I actually worked with that person. Her name was Ambassador Susan Jacobs, and so I was her special assistant. So she was great. So she would travel. She did travel to I think 42 different countries. Doing diplomacy and meeting with government officials. So, pushing for better adoptions. She was great. The reason being because I was a social worker. So she really listened to me because as I was doing this, I was seeing the lack in child protection systems in the countries. So I was pushing for that if we wanted stronger intercountry adoptions, that the child welfare system before that had to be strengthened within each country. And so that would lessen then the possibility of, corruption and fraud and things like that. So she listened, and she would push for that. She would go to the countries and say, tell me what you're doing to protect the children. What is your birth registry? What is, how are you keeping your documents? How are the children being, treated? And then she would also ask for to see different programs and things. So if we knew USAID, for instance, had some kind of child protection program, she would ask to see that. If she heard about agencies or organizations that worked and did foster care, she would ask to see that to just kind of elevate and bring visibility to those services and things. So I think, we talk about this and you probably all know this, but adoption, I think at one point adoption was considered once you place the child with the family, then you're done. But as adult adoptees, and even in my experience, adoption is a lifelong process, and you start kind of figuring out what that means. I will very definitely admit that when I first started in this field, I was pretty naive. I thought adoption was great and everyone, who can be adopted, and that should be was a wonderful option. I still think it's a wonderful option. It can be a great option for permanency for children, but I also learned about some of the dark practices that happen, and about about children having the right in the efforts that we try to do for family preservation. And then even in Korea, you found out that a lot of these birth moms really wanted to parent, but they didn't have the supports and they felt like this was the only option. So if there was like stronger child welfare or, welfare supports for single parents or single moms, that they might not have chosen to do adoption. So I think it's, as with anything, right, as social workers, we understand there's no black and white, that there's a lot of gray and there's a lot of complexities to the work that we do and to the processes and things that we have to try to manage. So, but like one of the things that happened during the time, and you might have heard about this and why this is so important. So Reuters at the time there's horrifying story about children being rehomed. And I use rehomed in parentheses, or with like a little what am I saying? Quote marks. Because that term was actually out of the animal community with like animals being rehomed. And so anyway, and then it got used where parents were having problems with the kids that they adopted internationally, and they were trying to, quote, rehome them on the internet. So there was this Reuters investigation, and so that caused, like I said, adoption takes a lot of diplomacy and things. And so when the other countries heard that this was going on, some of them wanted to shut down adoptions and would no longer adopt let Americans adopt and things when they're hearing about this. So anyway, and then even just, it's interesting because in the work that I do currently, we talk about how children are so often kind of left off the table and they're like an afterthought. And some of it being because children, they don't vote, they don't have super PACs. And so people don't think about kids, or they say that kids matter if it's great for a photo op. But then they do a lot of policies and things that harm children. And so, like, even in these cases where kids are being rehomed and like the political kind of things. So as an example, Russia, there was something called the Magnitsky Act. And there was a gentleman, Magnitsky, who essentially was killed or assassinated by Russia because he was, trying to he was just an activist. And anyway, he was killed. And so Congress went and passed this act because they wanted to put like Russian officials on a list to not be able to travel to the US. So then Russia said, fine, we'll do the same thing. But United States didn't care. It didn't cause any reaction. But then what happened was then Russia said, oh, we are going to no longer do adoptions with the United States. And that actually caused some got a reaction because all the potential adoptive parents who were in the middle of their adoption process were very upset when their adoption had been stalled or stopped. And so that actually got attention from Congress and from our government. So that's just an example, I think, of how kids can be used as pawns and in politics and things. So anyway, I'll pause there. Is there any other questions?
I have a question. Do we adopt American kids out? Do other countries want to adopt American kids as much as we adopt other countries' kids?
Yes. So little known, but yes, the US is a sending country. So we do send children overseas. And primarily, actually, there's like a big population. And I can actually, if you look under in the Department of State, we have to, or the office has to do an annual report to Congress, and they will actually tell you the numbers of, where children are adopted into. Hold on, let me see. And where they're adopted to. So there's actually a number of kids that were adopted to, like I think it's to Denmark. So. Let me see. I'm seeing where is the reports? Because I'm just seeing here. Okay, adoptions from the United States. Here we go. Yeah, they call it outgoing adoptions. This is, I'll just put that link here. There's not a terrible number of them, but there is some. And I'm just looking for our, because there should be, they have to do an annual report, and I'm not seeing it. Here it is, congressional reports. Let's see. It looks like the most recent is 2024, so I'll put that. Yeah, but they have to do annual reports that kind of, and they're also supposed to report on like any cases that disrupt. And then they put the numbers. So let's see here. Yeah, they break it down. Number of, trying to see where they show outgoing. I'm not seeing it. But anyway, you can look at the report.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to sort of acknowledge Emma's comment here, but also like sharing that and how it changed my perspective and probably now created bias on my mind. But at the beginning of the class, we sort of did this thing where we said pro multiracial adoption and not. But I recently actually had my little case at, I'm in school-based practicum, and I got an email that my kid is no longer coming to school, that they have transferred out, and sort of looking at it, the family decided that they were not able to meet this kid's mental health needs, but also cultural needs. It was a it was a multi so the child was black, the family was white,
Okay.
but that they were still pursuing to adopt the smaller sibling, the younger sibling, which to me and all, and I hear you, Emma, because I was like, I need to go out and cry. Again, I am aware that this is like a single case, and I cannot
I need
think
to
that
do some
everything
deep
will be
breaths
this way.
after hearing that.
But it
Oh
really
my God.
brought my sort of thought about just adoption processes and all. And I thought of that when you said I was naive when I started, right? Like I think sometimes when we're in this position, we want to do one thing and we kind of dive into it. But there's just so much to still experience, not really learn out of a book or anything, but experience to then really deepen your understanding and how you choose to advocate in different areas. But I had like so many questions, right? And of course, the child, I mean, this is a kid from another, so this kid was adopted in another state. So that kid literally had to get picked up by that state. And I mean, shipped back. I mean, I don't want to say something, but like returned. And um and it was this whole thing too between getting the mental health treatment here, but because that kid was on a different Medicaid system from another state, then they had to receive it there, not in Maryland. So I just have so many questions, and I'm like, oh, and obviously, out of like, they're not going to share, but do these parents get flagged in a way? Like you say you weren't able to culturally, or you're not able to adopt a child who has a certain uh, mental health need, then you're flagged for that. Like you can't do it again.
Uh, I So because I have been out of this and don't know all the ins and outs, there is not like there's not some central database, that has this. And we had like I had in my experience some situations where um well like parents who had because they had to go through not only like the State Department, but because the immigration process is actually through, well, now, USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services, like you'd have to apply there and then you had to get FBI prints and things. And something happened where the prospective parent got a DUI, but it happened after he already had done the FBI prints. So we didn't get notified of that he had a DUI. So I know there's like ways, and then we had some situations where parents might got denied by one agency and then they didn't disclose that and came to like another agency to get the home study and didn't disclose that they had been denied. And we like agencies don't know about that because there was no system, at the time that like let you know that this person went to, you know what I mean, XYZ agency in Connecticut and were denied. And because of like confidentiality, you couldn't.
That's awful.
Yeah.
Yeah, can I just add, I mean, that I don't know like the system at all. And that itself is just like a crazy can that you just put the number in my mind. Like I cannot believe that private, not private, things that are not regulated, like, whoa, that blows my mind. Can you like speak more? I know you spoke obviously about the Hague Convention and the United States like getting more regulation, but can you speak about like just how, I'm sure it's very complicated, but just how that kind of looks like what what is regulated?
It's state by state. So, each state has their own process or regulations for home studies, for instance. And but because like intercountry adoptions are private, there was like, yes, the agency would have to get approved through the state to be able to provide those services. But again, because the regulations were all different state to state. So because of having the adoption convention, it then gave at least like a uniform standard. So anyone who was doing overseas adoptions then had to abide by, the regulations in the Intercountry Adoption Act, that laid out. So that was, for instance, like it had to have minimum of 8 hours of education. And that was like compromise because I think 8 hours is stinky. Like that is not enough. But that was what the compromise was, that everyone was like that we could get approved through. That was acceptable to people. So that was the minimum was 8 hours. And yes, there's like different systems because, for instance, in foster care system, there was like more support and maybe funding and coverage of mental health services or, through the subsidy kind of things, you had access to that. You don't for intercountry adoption. So if you adopt from Russia, it's a private adoption, your own insurance has to cover that, which I'll be honest, I felt like, yeah, and I don't know, I know this is being recorded, but that I felt like that's the way it should be because parents are saying that they have enough money, they have the insurance or whatever to cover. And if you're choosing to adopt from Korea, then your own insurance should be able to cover that. Where like there's a certain I don't know. And maybe that's different. That I feel like there's certain responsibilities that if the state or the country takes a child into custody, that there's certain responsibilities that, that Maryland has. If you pull a child from a family in Baltimore, then Maryland has a certain responsibility to see the welfare of that child. It's not necessarily the same responsibility, but I mean, someone else might argue if you are a family in Maryland and you adopt from Russia, then that child becomes your child. So then Maryland should help, support that child in mental health services. I don't know. I know there's been some things where states have allowed families who've adopted internationally to access like the post-adoption supports. So particularly like after that Reuters, you know, feature, there was some like more openness for families to use those services and things. So I don't know if that really answers all your questions, Becky. It is like it's a very much of a different, it's a different system.
But were you saying you were you were saying that I was trying to catch this, but like that federally there's no like, department like of child welfare, but there is in the state, and so that's why it's state to state, at least at this point.
For intercountry adoptions?
No, just in general.
In general, so like foster care adoptions are, that's like state to state, right? And then and when I think who was it before, we're talking about where that child had to go back to the other state. There's like interstate issues that has to happen. When you place if you have a child in foster care in Maryland and then they're going to a family in Arizona, you have to do the interstate compact and things, the agreement. I do find it very complicated. I think because I have heard about this, like where if the child was in foster care in California and they were adopted to Florida, then the California kind of has the responsibility for like any long-term mental health needs, which to me doesn't really make sense because if they're in Florida, they need to get the care in Florida and to send the child back. Um, but I also know that I think this shows like our mental health systems like not great because I don't think um, the again, this is like a lifelong issue. This trauma, as we know, is lifelong. It's not something that goes away, or that's completely cured when they're put into a permanent home. And I think too, especially it's happening more. I think somebody was asking like, why would somebody choose, right, to do intercountry adoption? I think at one time they thought intercountry adoption, the children were younger, but then they were also less likely to have mental health problems. But now that's not true, and we actually say some of those breaks in caregivers and things, they're just as much at risk as kids out of foster care and things. And in some ways, you have less information. So I think like in Russia, there's a lot that was found that there's no information, that was happening. So you didn't know the healthcare needs, and there was things like fetal alcohol, exposure that would come out, et cetera. So I don't, and I think anytime you adopt older kids too, you're going to have like potentially more issues there, and I'll share like a story on like even for myself. I was 5.5 years old when I was adopted. Didn't speak English when I came. Uh, I don't know. And probably some people would argue that I'm like not that mentally healthy. I think I'm mentally healthy and high functioning. But I know, like, for instance, my mom said, like, I did not tell my parents that I loved them till I was in 8th grade. Like my mom remembers. That was like, and I never said that. So, and I think it's who knows. Like I can probably tell you, I think there's feelings and not that I ne necessarily consciously knew, but I think people would say I am a kind of a type A personality. I followed all the rules, like strove really high. But I remember in the back of my mind kind of thinking it's like I need to show my parents that it was worth it for them to adopt me, to like to not have them regret, their decision or whatever, and I have talked to other adoptee friends of mine who have talked about that too. Is like, because I think some of the subtle messages that you get, whether through the media, I mean, think about what was it I was just watching? I don't know. Like I'm watching all these crime series and whatever, and there's always like some episode in there about an adoptee, right? Like who goes like the bad seed or the damaged adoptee who goes and murders their teacher or their friend or whatever and things. Or I feel like too, in all the fairy tales, right? Like they lost a parent. It's like a huge, like if you think about every single character, and losing parents and stuff, because it's a big trauma and it's a big loss. And so, I think you talk about like all of us kind of talk about the kind of the subtle messages is that you're so lucky to have been adopted. Oh, that your parents adopted you from Korea. Korea, was probably, um, you know, I don't know. And I'm going off on a tangent here, but I have to say, like, growing up, my friends and I laugh now, and even for like my kids, like growing up, I never knew like people didn't know where Korea was, or they would always ask, "Are you Chinese? Are you Japanese?" And then I'd say, "No, I'm was adopted from Korea." And they would go, "Where's that? We've never heard of that." So it's very different because Korea's having a total moment right now between like K-pop, K-dramas, all the food. Like, how many people know gochujang and kimchi? This was not my experience growing up. So I kind of like tease our daughters, like, you don't even know what it was like, because now everyone kind of knows it. But anyway, yeah, I think somebody had their hand up. No?
Oh, sorry, that was me. I was really debating, like, I can really talk. So I was like, do I need to say things? Probably not. But everything you're saying is so, like, interesting. Like, I don't know a lot about international adoption. I have an adopted brother who's Native American. And so a lot of what you're saying, I see so many commonalities. It's really interesting to hear the international part. But, like, he's Ojibwe and living in Maryland, people think he's, Hispanic, and like he went to kindergarten, hardly talking to strangers, and they almost put him in an English as a second language class because they assumed he didn't know English and stuff. But I just like while you're talking, I'm remembering like I grew up in a very religious environment, and a lot of people that I knew viewed adoption as a calling, and there was like this sort of benevolence to it, and I just like that's partly something that frustrates me so much because I just view parenthood as so like you have to be selfless, you have like it is benevolent, but like it is so important, and like children are not disposable, they're not commodities, they're not like I just, I think people really pursue having a family. And then I almost wonder, like, do you ever think about maybe not? Like, if, like, that's an option too, like, maybe not to have a family because of these stories where people have adopted and then rehome. So I think it's interesting as a culture, I feel like we really encourage people to be a family and have babies and like I don't necessarily think that's wrong, but I just you shouldn't rush into that because of a cultural norm or something like from my point of view. It's so important. Like that little brother, he might be my brother, but like from the time we adopted him, I was like, I am committed to your well-being. Like you are in our family, like we are committed to you. And that's my whole family said that. Like he has so much support and stuff. And I like that's so beautiful to me. And he's doing so well. And I'm so proud of him. And I talk about him all the time. So when I'm like, there is
But
a
you know what
world
I would
where
say
it's
about
okay
that?
to not
Yeah.
be a parent.
Yeah, so I
But
would say there's like so many things that I think you bring up. Was absolutely, I think that there is the story, right, of like, okay, you're born, you're supposed to get married, and that, like you find your person and then you get married and you have kids and things. And so for people who end up having to go through adoption to build their family, we talk about that whole loss. Like, if it's infertility, so oftentimes that brings them to adoption. And I've heard from some adoptive parents and things where they talk about they're so focused on, um, I need to be a parent, I need to be a parent, I need to do whatever. And then, but they're not really thinking about, do I actually want to be a parent? Because it's just kind of the whole societal narrative is supposed to be, this is like the trajectory of your life. And then when it doesn't happen that way, and then they're not stepping back to say, okay, is this really what I want? Uh, so that's like one. Um, and I think that's where through the home study process, you're supposed to be kind of exploring all of that and trying to figure out, what is it that you want. I personally, I think some people I know was really offended. They would say you shouldn't work with them if they say that they can't parent a black child, or that if they're white and they come in and say, okay, we can parent a Asian child, but we can't parent a black child. Personally, that did not bother me. I felt like if you know what your limits are and how you can, like, if you can best meet that child's needs and you know that you can't deal with the issues of, a black child, fine, you know. Like I remember one family that we had, that they actually originally came in to adopt from China, and they were rejected by China. China said they wouldn't adopt or work with them because there were some health conditions that the family had. So they said, no, we're not going to work. And then, and same thing, they couldn't adopt from Korea because of like some of the health conditions. So then they ended up going to Ethiopia. You know, they actually left the agency because they were, you know, like not happy with our agency, and they went to this other agency, and I had heard that they adopted from Ethiopia. And I was a little concerned because when they had first come in, they were just saying, oh, we don't know how to like we can't, you know, we don't know how to raise like Black or African children. So, and then I heard that that's where they're going through. Um, so it's something. And I guess to say, I know like I'm talking about, I guess, all these stories and kind of the horror stories that happen, but there's also like really successful, you know, stories and things. And I don't want to say there's like good adoptees or good adoption stories or bad adoption stories. It's just, it's complex. But I think some of these regulatory frameworks, like the regulatory frameworks of the Adoption Convention, I think of listening to adult adoptees and their experience, of research that's happened on like what, you know, what works, what processes works, research, and access to therapies. Those are all really important things. Um, because I'm also very much a proponent of children should not be sitting in orphanages. Children should not, um, you know, be in a situation where they don't have people who can care and who can care for them and support them as they're growing up. But, and I think that's why I moved out of adoption, and I'm in like now the child advocacy, is because I'm trying to figure out, you know, and advocating for policies to try to help children. So that's kind of like been my growth and development of, you know, I am supportive of intercountry adoption, but it needs to be that I need to be advocating for those efforts, of child protection systems, a better, you know, training of social workers, social service, you know, social worker development, you know, workforce in other countries and things. So, in doing those efforts, I think are also important. So.
I know Eve has a question and Vanessa, and I
Okay.
think there was a question in the chat too.
Hi, good evening. I just want to say thank you for sharing something you said earlier. I know I'm going to go a little far back, but you made a statement about how you and some of your friends who also were adopted, like didn't say I love you until a certain point. And I thought that that was really interesting that you shared it, and it gave me a new perspective because it made me realize like not enough people think about what happens once children are adopted. It's kind of just like, yay, they were adopted. That's it, like door closed. But then it just made me think like, oh, wow. I'm wondering, and if you feel comfortable answering this, I'm wondering if she felt supported, like after the fact, or like had was told, like, oh, here are some resources in case you're feeling XYZ, and it just made me think about something I never have. So I thank you for that also.
Oh, thanks, Eve. So like I said, at the time that I was adopted, like my parents were kind of told, these are your daughters, treat them as your daughters, and that was it. You know, there were some little things, I think they were given some book that had like some recipes, like Korean recipes or something. Because I remember, I think when I was in eighth grade, I was w wanting to maybe try some food, and so they pulled out that book, and there's a recipe in there for Korean barbecue or bulgogi. So, you know, my dad and I like went and found the ingredients and, you know, to make that. But there wasn't the culture camps, and there wasn't the like homeland tours or support groups for adoptive parents or adoptees. That just wasn't. And then, like I said, many of the places that I lived, my sister and I were oftentimes the only Asians. I think we had a brief stint in California, near San Francisco, and I do remember like we went to Chinatown, and I remember feeling very uncomfortable like going to Chinatown. And so I kind of blended, we blended in physically, but then they were just speaking to me in a language, of course, that I didn't understand. And so then I felt very like out of place there. And I do remember thinking I'm never going to fit in anywhere, you know. And I was also sort of like, these aren't really my people because they're Chinese and I'm Korean. So just that kind of disconnected feeling. I think people talk about it. What did I feel like? I felt like a banana. They call it like feeling like a banana, where felt like I was this white person trapped inside this Asian body, because culturally that was the way I was raised, by white parents. Um, so then it was as I was growing up and then getting into it was really kind of in college, probably where I started kind of exploring what does it mean to be adopted from Korea and being sort of Korean, because then in college was when I actually, I had one of my who ended up becoming a very good friend. She lived like two doors down from me. She was from Korea. She came with her sister who had married. And so let's see, Wasu came, I think she was like 13, when she came to the US. So, and then I would go home with her and her sister would make these like huge Korean meals and things. So, I started kind of getting more exposed. And then honestly, what really helped was just the birth of the internet. So, for all the downsides of the internet, I think when that happened, then there was just connection. Like all of a sudden, there's these like Yahoo groups with Korean adoptees, and you started reading the stories. And that's when I actually found out there's some adoptees on there that had found their birth families. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this could happen. I could find my birth family. Like here's the story. Um, and then it was also at that time, it was in 1999, Holt, it was Holt, Korea. Susan Cox, who worked for them, she was like adoptee number 132 or something. So she worked for them. She was vice president. Anyway, she had this idea of trying to get Korean adoptees together. So they held this event called The Gathering in Washington, D.C., and there was 400 Korean adoptees from across the country and from over in Europe that gathered in D.C. And I have to tell you, like we all talked about it. We were just blown away, because you walk into this room and there's 400 other people, and so even though we're all different, but we all share this experience of being adopted from Korea. And so for many of us, it was the first time that they had seen like another Korean person or, another adoption. I have to tell you, like even my husband, when he walked into the room, he was like, wow. And then they broke us out into like decades, and then they had the room with the spouses. So Paul was, put into the room with the spouses, so they got to all share, what it was like to be married to an adoptee. And so that's like a whole other, when we talk about adoption being a lifelong process of like spouses, and then for our children. And I think when Emma was talking about, for her brother, uh, yeah, I mean, like for my children now, it's like an issue because all their grandparents were white, but they're half Korean. And what does that mean? And then I think like when Emma, I think was saying her brother was mistaken for being Latino or Hispanic, that's our second daughter is always mistaken for being Latina. Like, she has kind of more the round eyes of my husband. So she looks very much like she could be Latina, but what that means. So, but anyway, Vanessa?
Hi. I think mine is kind of like maybe like a multi-part question, but I'm gonna try to make it a little more concise. So my brother is adopted from Russia, and he kind of like piggybacking off of like what you were just saying. Um, like I'm wondering, like he also has a hard time like saying I love you and like having those attachments. Um, and I'm wondering, like, thinking about like attachment and like attachment theory, um, like what would the most like effective interventions be, like if you know, for coming from that background, especially with like cultural differences, and thinking about how, not being as trusting with others might impact like the therapeutic relationship and seeking treatment.
Oh my gosh, good question. Yeah, I wish my friend Joy was on because she's actually she was adopted from Korea and then also is a private therapist. So a couple things. Uh, what we've heard from adoptees, honestly, has been and even in my experience of like attempting to go to therapy and things like that, um, you want to try to find like an adoption competent therapist. And I'm not of the belief that you have to be adopted to, that you have to go to an adoptee therapist, but I think you need to have a therapist that is adoption competent. And that means too many times that um, I've heard adoptees go to therapy and the therapist never even mentions adoption or that it could be an issue, that, that some of the feelings of loss or abandonment or anxiousness about separation could be rooted in adoption or, some of the trauma kind of things or, exploring like what memories that they might have or how this might play into it. There's just been too many stories where therapists don't even acknowledge or explore that. As far as like really great therapeutic tools, I'm like not probably the best one to talk to. I mean, I think it depends on what the issues are. Whether there's like depression, whether there's anxiety, whether there's panic attacks, or how it's really, influencing your life. Some of the things, and I don't know if this really like makes sense, but like there's some things where I attributed it to being adopted. I was like, oh, I'm kind of like type A. I'm like, really whatever. I think I had said, that I thought that, I was like kind of perfectionistic and things was because I was like very tense about being adopted or whatever. So I will tell you this, that I when I found my birth family, and of course I had been adopted when I was 5.5. So when I found my birth family and then asked them, they kind of described me that same way. So this whole time where I thought it was because I was adopted, I think there's like some inherent personality traits that were there even before I was adopted. Also having our like two kids and seeing there's nothing more humbling than probably becoming a parent for any of you who are parents. Having like our daughter, one of our daughters in particular, has a very similar personality to mine, so she wasn't adopted, but she has some of those things. So I think there's definitely things obviously that can be attributed to adoption and should be explored in therapy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's definitely adoption. I guess if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So,
that makes sense. Thank you.
sure. So I put some things in the chat because I just wanted to show kind of like current things and what's happened again of like decisions that can happen or things that are happening right now. So one of the big things that happen actually for adoptees are that when you're adopted to the US, you're not US citizens. And so like in the process when I was adopted, citizenship was not automatic, and then we had to go to court. My parents had to go to court, and I became a naturalized citizen. So I am a naturalized US citizen. Unfortunately, there are some parents who, for whatever reason, did not do that. And so some adoptees did not realize that they weren't or they weren't US citizens. And so they might have found out when they went to go apply for their driver's license or when they went to get a passport and found out that they weren't US citizens, not realizing. And so there's been some horrific stories of adoptees who got in trouble with the law and things. And then it's like, there's the whole thing if you are not a US citizen and you have criminal activity and things that you can be deported. Well, there are some adoptees who actually have gotten deported. And there's a number of, I think there's some estimates that there could be like 30,000 adoptees in the US who don't have their US citizenship. So there's been some advocacy efforts. And so those are some of the things that I put. There's a group called Adoptees for Justice who is trying to work on that and has a bill in Congress, for instance, to try to rectify that. So there was something called, because they knew that this was an issue back in 2000, and there was a Citizenship Act of 2000 that was passed that made citizenship automatic for adoptees, but it was only for adoptees who were like 18, who turned 18 at that time. So there was this whole if you were older than that, you weren't part of that automatic citizenship. So this bill is trying to rectify that. Because if you can imagine, if you are adopted at birth, and then, you don't have any ties to your birth country. You don't know the language, you don't know the culture, and all of a sudden you're getting deported back, with no ties, no, et cetera. So it's a really big issue. There's a case, although I think this Iranian adoptee had been kind of working on her case because she didn't have her citizenship, but that's been kind of in the news. And then I posted also a link. There's been a recent case which really angered me. It was about a U.S. Marine who adopted an Afghan orphan, and I think this case was going on even when I was working at the State Department, and I was really quite upset because the story was, I believe that her parents had been somehow killed in some of the fighting. She was left an orphan. However, there was family that had come forward in Afghanistan that wanted to parent her, but this U.S. Marine and his wife was determined to adopt her. And so they went through some process, brought her here, and then the Afghani family members were fighting it. And it's just been ruled last week, the Virginia Supreme Court overturned, the lower court said that the adoption was fraudulent and that the child needed to be with the Afghani family. But the Virginia Supreme Court, I think in a 4-3 ruling, overturned the lower courts and saying that that the child can stay with the Marines or with the U.S. Soldiers. So I'm just really upset about it because it was a kind of, I think, shady process, and that there's family in Afghanistan that wants to parent her. So that's like that story. And then, as I was saying, there's been a number of adult adoptees and even myself who have found birth family. And so all these stories, and we knew was coming out that there had been fraud in our adoption process and things. And so Korea's essentially having a reckoning about that. And so they in Korea have had a truth commission to investigate these stories. And so that's something that's happening in Korea. And I will actually, where is that? I can also send the link. Let me see. Because where is it? Shoot. Well, now I can't find it. Frontline did a whole documentary about, the Korean adoption process. And, and that was when they're calling it like a Korea's reckoning. But I'll send you the link and you can watch that. Okay.
I know there was a question, with international adoptions, can families return the child? That was a question that came up.
Technically, no, because they're full and legal adoptions, so they can't. Or they would be disrupting the adoption, but legally, and this is the thing, legally, they're supposed to be as if they're born to you, and usually they've been stripped of their citizenship of that country. Although now I think some countries are moving towards where you can retain your citizenship. But that they're US citizens and they're legally as if the child was born to you, your child. Now, has it been done? Yes, it has been done. Because there's been some stories where a family has, dropped off the child back in Russia, for instance. So, yeah. Okay, somebody was asking, and I am totally fine to answer, what would be my biggest personal and or professional accomplishment or best memory be? That's actually a really good question. Okay, personal accomplishment. Like I am really a proud mom to my two daughters. So it's like I'd say that. I love being a mom. Professional accomplishment or best memory. I think I'm proud of the work that I started at my adoption agency, although I was like not happy about it because it took so long, but I was proud of like establishing the education program that I had at one agency. And the other thing that I had, but I felt like it took a long time was, so Korea had a system where, if you can imagine, they allowed children to be escorted from Korea to the United States. So literally, like if you are a college student who happened to be visiting Korea and you put in and said, "Hey, I'm going to be flying back to the US, I can escort a baby," they would pay for your plane ticket and you could escort a baby home. So, so when I was there, I was like, "This is terrible practice," because if you can imagine, the baby has yet, or the child has yet another break in caregiver. They go from the foster home to this total stranger that they have to ride with for 15 hours on the plane, and then they get placed into the arms of their adoptive parents. Then I also felt like adoptive parents should go to their child's country, to their child's birth country, and see and experience their child's birth country, also meet the child's foster family, and get information directly from the foster family about how to transition or help smooth the transition a little bit. So I had very much pushed with my agency that this was not good practice and that that parents should travel. And actually, all the other countries, they were required to travel. So Korea just had this one quirk that they, allowed escorts. So I was able to get um, that policy changed. So I was happy about that. Uh, yeah. And then I guess finally, as far as at the State Department, I think I was proud of my work in trying to uh, talk more about the whole kind of child protection process, um, and incorporating that into my boss's work. I also happened to be there in the State Department when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State. So I know she's probably a divisive figure. I am a complete fan of hers because she was very much an advocate for children and families. So anytime we asked her to do anything for our office, she did. Uh, and she very much supported anything to try to help children and families. So that's that. Any other questions?
I did have a question. When you talk about the home study process, and you talk about like the money that they would have to pay, like what would be like the figure that
Yeah.
they pay?
So I don't know. I'm sure it's gone up. So, because I've like left the whole adoption process in 2000, what is it? 2009, so I was like out. But at that time, people were paying anywhere from $1,500 to $2,000 for the home study. And just to kind of give you a sense, like an adoption, like what the cost of the adoption, right, for all the fees and things could be anywhere from like let me think. When I left for Korean adoption, which is like relatively cheaper, although those fees were going up because the process was taking longer, so the cost of foster care was upping. But it was like I think anywhere from like it was like 24,000, for Korean, but I know it could go up to like 40, 50,000 for intercountry adoption. And I'm assuming that the costs probably went up because in Korea, um, so Korea was doing different things with their family court. And so it was really delaying. And I know like right now, I think it was taking because they're trying to get children placed in Korea first before they would be considered for adoption in a country, which is all fine, except then it delayed even more so that children then were coming to the US at the age of like 24 months. And so as we know, like the older the child gets, then the tighter the bond, and then just like the difficulty and things in the transition. So someone else, I thought somebody else had their hand raised.
I did. I think it's a question more for Dr. Boone. In the US, I mean, adoption does it have a cost other than like the legality of it? Because I'm thinking of like adoption when through child protective services. That's not necessarily there's not a cost to it, right?
No.
Yeah, there's not supposed to be. So like the costs of home study, post placement, all of that should be covered. And then you also have like, outlining what the post adoption costs or, like potential can be so that you can get, services or any kind of medical things are covered. So,
I'm still struggling with the why we don't adopt. I mean, I think it's all great, but um, and again, I've seen how so many good stories and successful stories within the deaf community specifically of
mhm.
children who never would have even access to a language at all and are able to find their culture here. But I'm still struggling with the connection of like I know okay it takes forever in the U.S. but just wait.
Oh,
Um,
so like, of why people wouldn't adopt, that they would go in a country versus here in the
yeah.
US. Yeah, I mean, and it's hard because there's also a need overseas as well. Like those kids, and you think about like, I mean, I think about even in my case, like I having met my birth family. So my birth parents were actually both deceased when I found my birth family. So who I found was actually my maternal uncle and his wife. And and they had like and they had three children, and fortunately their daughter like could speak English pretty well, so was able to translate, otherwise I wouldn't be able to understand. um but in speaking with them, uh my birth parents didn't sound like they were in any place to be able to parent my sister and me. So, I mean, in weighing that, like I don't know what life I would have had in Korea. I would have probably not like gone to college. Now, does that mean, that it was worth being, sent away from my birth country? I don't know, and I think that's hard to say of like, what if, right? What if I had stayed in Korea and what would my life have been like? And, because I think my friend she spent quite a few years in the orphanage, and she went back to her orphanage, and she worked there for a year after she got done with college. And so she had some friends from her orphanage days who are still at the orphanage, and she said they're doing fine, so I think she has a perspective of like, would it have been so bad to have grown up in the orphanage? you know um I don't know, you know and I think uh I know, I mean, our foster care system isn't great either here in the US. It's not ideal. And I think kids are really uh, there's some really traumatized children. And I'll be honest, I think I would find it a challenge. And I also don't think that people should adopt if they can't meet those challenges. So I think the combination of the trauma that these kids go through, if parents can't handle that, and then there's not really great supports for the challenges that these children might have, that's not good either. So um, and I would also add, I think nowadays, like a lot of the intercountry adoptions are of children who do have like who are disabled and have like extensive needs. And so then, you could also say, well, if you are willing to adopt a child from China who has all these like physical needs, then, you should definitely adopt them in the foster care system. So, I mean, and again, I think this is where it just shows how complicated this is, because it's like on one hand, a child with severe disabilities in China may never have any kind of quality of life. So then they can be adopted by a family here who could give them a better quality of life. On the other hand, too, if and this has been one of the criticisms of Korea, that Korea had um, uh, well, relied on intercountry adoption to send kids out who needed families instead of developing their own child welfare system. So that's been one of the criticisms. Like if Korea, instead of sending their kids out and did better to develop their child welfare system so that, the kids could have stayed in Korea. So, and that is like a little bit my concern on some of this, like, even when I was at the State Department, there was more of a thing of like, okay, Vietnam, they're not gonna send kids who are healthy, but they'll send kids who have disabilities for intercountry adoption. Those kids will be available for intercountry adoption, which is fine. But then I was like, Vietnam needs to do better in developing systems and developing supports to help their family, help families keep their children, even if they're disabled, and not have the first option be that they get sent away or that they get sent to an orphanage to languish in orphanage care, instead of like maybe if they had some kind of support, the parents would keep the kids. So if that makes sense.
Really appreciate how you contrast all of that and kind of there's no right answer. No, there's no like you should do this versus that or support this or that. I think as almost everything in social work, it's individual, right? But would you say that adoption somehow is like a band-aid to bigger systemic issues of, I mean, kids shouldn't be, there are cases, right? Like maybe I'll say, for example, parents who die in a car accident, they need to be adopted, or parents who are forward and say, we cannot raise a child, right?
Yeah.
But just thinking of the no abortion, sort of other barriers or other laws, and I'm really trying to pick my words, of other things that are happening that are just way bigger, where we will have a lot less kids in the systems in anywhere in the world if they
Mhm.
were resolved or addressed. Addressed, I would say, not resolved, like sometimes they can be, but if they were just addressed, as you mentioned, Vietnam needed to do better, right, for the complex care kids. But same here in the US, there's so many, as we kind of take a step back on some, again, mentioning the abortion laws that um, were a thing at one point, and now we're going backwards.
Yeah, no, I hear you, Melissa. I mean, I think this is where, as social workers, because of the way we're trained, because we look at systems, because we can look at the macro and micro, macro, direct practice at macro practice. We have a unique perspective and we have unique skills that we can bring to this. And so I think each person, you as social workers, can kind of decide how you want to make that difference, And if you see within your agency or the work that you do where there can be changes or where things can get better or how you can advocate for your client or advocate for your child, that you work with, that's what you can do, And yes, there's also bigger policies at the federal level. So that's what I'm working on is, federal level policies, whether that's the child tax credit, whether that's, my portfolio actually happens to be um, um, international children's issues. So I'm very much closely following all the obliteration that's happened with USAID and our foreign assistance. I mean, I'll push one of the big things that my agency does is we analyze the federal budget and all the different programs and what share of that goes to kids. So you can imagine not much, considering that kids make up a quarter of a population. I think they make about 7 cents of every dollar goes towards benefiting kids. Internationally, about 9 cents of every like $1 of foreign assistance benefits kids overseas. So hold on, I'm just like looking for a budget book so you can look and you can see. So I mean, that's the way I'm choosing right now to feel like I can make a difference. Is yeah, through advocating on federal policy. But, we work with plenty of state agencies and state organizations, and they're looking at the state level. My daughter works for the mayor's office here in Baltimore. She's looking at what can we do in Baltimore City. So you figure out within your context of how you can try to make that difference or make things better. And, that's why we do social work. So for as much of a challenge as that is and things. So
Well, thank you so much. I was just
sure.
seeing if there was any other comments, but I just wanted to say, I really appreciate you and just everything that you brought. I would definitely say this is an area where I have like very limited knowledge. I learned so much from everything that you shared. So I just really appreciate you coming and talking to us and sharing about your personal experience and also your professional experience. Um, I just really enjoyed it.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and I apologize if I'm just putting my email if you need to email me with any other questions or anything else that you have. And I apologize if I was kind of rambling and all over the place. So I hope I
No, it
helped.
was not. It wasn't all over the place because I was like, oh wow, like I just really showed how I just had absolutely no knowledge. Like just so focused on Maryland's child welfare system, had absolutely no knowledge of anything else that was happening anywhere else. So
No, I should be like listening in on this class. So if you do it again, let me know. And if I can audit it or like listen in, because I would like to be more familiar with Maryland's child welfare system.
okay, anything you want to know, I can.
Sounds
A lot of
good.
things are very all over the place, but anything you want
I
to know.
know, and I've heard like I know actually Rafael Lopez, who
Yeah,
was the head, and I know he's resigning
yeah,
and things, and then like Vinny Schiraldi. I mean, I know there's like things that are kind of you know um a little bit up in the air too for kids here.
yeah,
Yeah, and I'm also concerned because of the federal policies, like the cuts and SNAP benefits and education and all sorts of stuff, then how that'll trickle down to
yeah.
state level as well. So yeah. So I don't know. All of you just keep fighting and keep
Yes.
keep your spirits up. That's what I do. I try to take it day by day. So but this is a pleasure and thanks so much for having me. And if there's anything else I can do, let me know. I do have my email there, so I am open to hearing if you have any other questions or anything like that, or any way that I can help. So
Thank you.
sure,
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
sure.
Thank you.
That was so good. I just
That
had
was
no
really cool.
expectations, but I just had no idea about anything. So that was really good. And I think it also complements like kind of just what we've been talking about just like child welfare in general, like the purpose of it and just some harm that can come, some benefits, and just trying to balance like the best interests of children and how it can be so political and how the systems can mess it up and just like just so many things. And I didn't realize that the class had so many, like you all have so many personal experiences or just families in terms of like adoption. So I think that was just a good conversation just to have and just to be able to think about all that stuff. Essence?
Is it possible? I don't know if we could get another person to come speak who may have gone through something similar, but they are hi buddy. They're of like a minority and how their um adoption process went, sort of.
Sure. I was trying to see um I definitely know about like foster care. I was thinking of trying to bring in some people that kind of went through like Maryland's foster care system. Um,
Mhm.
so yes. And if you know anybody, let me know because I don't know anybody off the top
A
of my
lot of
head.
my people are in DC, if that's okay.
Like, yeah, that's just about it.
Okay, I'll reach out.
Yeah, I think any lived experience is just good to have. I'm gonna stop the recording just